Welcome back to another AP US History video lecture. This time, we're going to be reviewing Unit 4 for AP US History, and that runs from about 1800 to 1848. We're going to go a little bit past that, just because I think there are some big issues that go along with this. So we're going to go from about 1800 really up until about the mid-1850s. So the main focus here is going to be the question of whether or not the country could unite and become a nation. Now, for a lot of people for a long time, that's been kind of taken for granted, right? After the War of 1812, the idea is we became one country. But more and more, it really has looked like there really wasn't one country for some time. Instead of one national identity, there were actually multiple regional identities. So our main focus here is going to be what caused that. And of course, the issue here that divides up the country is the issue of slavery. So what is my overall thesis? Yes, once again, even for our reviews, we have a thesis statement. So here's my thesis statement. While the country after the War of 1812 definitely did have a sort of national cohesion around some major values, the regional battle over slavery really caused multiple regional identities. Okay, let's start off with this issue of growing a nationalist identity. After the War of 1812, the United States signed a treaty with Great Britain called the Treaty of Ghent. Love that word, sounds very much like a Star Wars treaty. The question here had to do with American identity. So right after the Treaty of Ghent, the United States had a sense of we are independent, and so because of that, there could be a sense of national identity. In fact, there's a good piece of evidence that this was the case. It was called the American System. This was developed by a man named Henry Clay. He made the argument that what Americans needed to do after this great victory against Great Britain in the War of 1812 was to develop one country system around a market. So the United States federal government should develop roads and highways connecting up the states. There should be tariffs to protect small industries and companies here in the United States. And there should be investments into the country, especially the creation of a national bank. So there you go, right? Growing national identity under what was known as the Treaty of Ghent. Or another good example was Monroe's era of good feelings, a time period of massive economic growth in a sense that the country was really united. Yet at this exact same time period, we had regional differences. The North saw itself as a place of freedom for free labor. The South held on to slave labor, and people were expanding out west with a variety of different beliefs on this issue. So that's when we get into the second big issue, and that is President Andrew Jackson and the development of a party system. So in the election of 1824, we had two men running, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And at the end of this, of course, as you might remember, there really was no clear winner off of this. In fact, Andrew Jackson had won the popular vote, he had won the Electoral College vote, but he didn't win enough that was required in order to win the overall election. So John Quincy Adams was able to make a deal with Henry Clay, in which if Henry Clay supported John Quincy Adams, he would become Secretary of State. This became known amongst Jackson's supporters as the corrupt bargain. So in 1828, Andrew Jackson would run on this, and he would win, he would become president. And he became president in the context of what is known as modern democracy. So what is that? That was when people were moving out west, they dropped this whole requirement to vote, the property requirement. And that really caused everybody to question whether or not property is a really good requirement to vote. Now, of course, this creates universal suffrage for white males. So we do have universal white male suffrage, but it starts a buildup for the desire for other people to have the right to vote as well. Now, the reason why this becomes important for the national identity is that Andrew Jackson's presidency becomes incredibly controversial. Andrew Jackson did a number of policies that created a lot of anger. So in the South, he's very popular because he supports states' rights. He vetoes the national bank. He supports slavery. He also established what was known as the spoils system and a kitchen cabinet. That was where he had his closest friends from the South advise him. All of this really angered a lot of people, especially in the North. They saw Andrew Jackson as being sort of the beginning of a new type of tyrant. And so they started up a new party called the Whig Party. So now we're going to have the Jacksonian Democrats and the Whigs. Why is this important? Well, we're not really seeing quite yet absolute regional parties, but we are seeing the development of regional parties, with most of the Whigs up in the north, although there were Whigs in the south as well, and the Jacksonian Democrats, mostly in the south, with some up in the north. In other words, the development of regional identities. So in the 1830s, then, we get into reform movements. Now, the most important, of course, was the Second Great Awakening. So you might remember the First Great Awakening, which goes back during that time period of like 1730s and 1740s. The First Great Awakening was a return to Puritan belief systems and a criticism of the British authority. With the Second Great Awakening, there's a criticism of both slavery and the Industrial Revolution, or the Market Revolution, that's taking place up in the Northeast. But what's really important about the Second Great Awakening, unlike the First Great Awakening, is the belief in perfectionism, that people would be able to perfect themselves here on Earth. Now, because of that, we start to see a lot of different criticisms of slavery. For example, the abolitionist movement at this time period included two wings. The immediate wing that said we've got to get rid of slavery now, and the gradualist wing that says we can hold on to it for a while, but just try to contain it. A good example of that is the Compromise of 1820. In the Compromise of 1820, Missouri had wanted to enter into the Union, and the problem was how to balance Missouri with the other states. Eventually, the solution was to have Maine enter in as a free state, Missouri is a slave state, and then to have the 3630 parallel, basically a line throughout the middle of the country drawn, with northern states above that free and southern states below that becoming slave. Now, how does that tie in the Second Great Awakening, especially when it happened much before the Second Great Awakening happened? Well, it's a really good example of what was happening at this time period of a criticism of slavery to either get rid of it or to gradually have it disappear by containing it to the south. Now, at the same time, we were going to see the Haitian Revolution that took place, in which black people in Haiti successfully created the first black nation. That inspired Nat Turner in the South to rebel against white people. Now, Nat Turner's rebellion fails, and because of that, the black codes are established in order to maintain order, a racial order in the South. Black people at that point kind of realized that violence is not going to work. But in their local culture, they practiced something called passive resistance. Passive resistance was a fight against slavery without outright violence. So good examples of that would be, for example, having church communities, or, for example, doing the Underground Railroad. Another good example of passive resistance would simply be to act like the stereotypes that many white people had in order to get around the white rules of that time period. Notice what's happening again here. We don't have one national identity, we have multiple identities. Not only do we have regional identities of North versus South versus West, but within the black community there is serious black agency. What do I mean by that? I mean that black people at this time period didn't just accept slavery, they fought against it within the constraints that they had. So they established their own culture, a culture of family and community and neighbors. So that leads into the 1850s with the variety of slave compromises. So in 1848, the Mexican-American War happened, with America winning that war. At the end of that, a whole bunch of states come in the Southwest, or territories, and that led to the Compromise of 1850. There was a need to balance between these new states that came in, and so because of that, California enters in as free, and then the way to balance out the rest was through popular sovereignty, allow those territories to vote on their own. Now, even at the end of all that, even if that was all to happen, the North would have a two-state advantage. So the agreement in the Compromise of 1850 was to have a stronger fugitive slave law, in which the South would get something, even though they weren't going to have an exact balance. This didn't work out in Massachusetts. Up in Massachusetts, the religious fervor up there was to oppose slavery altogether, and so they passed the personal liberty laws, in which they said, look, we're just not going to participate at all in returning slaves back. This is absolutely immoral. Well, you can imagine that caused a great stir between the North and the South, and we started to see the regions basically grow between the two. Then the South attempted to do what was called the Gadsden Purchase, in which they bought up land right north of Mexico to develop a transcontinental railroad that would connect the South all the way out to California. The North tried to do its own with that in the Kansas-Nebraska controversy. There was the Nebraska Territory. They broke up the territory into two. Nebraska became, since it's in the North, became free, and Kansas was supposed to become slave. But when they attempted to vote on this issue, people from both the North and the South ran to Kansas and voted on both sides and basically destroyed the ability for a clear identity to happen. In fact, at the end of this, we saw a civil war, or bleeding Kansas, erupt. In the midst of all of this, the Dred Scott case took place, in which the Supreme Court argued that Dred Scott, a slave who had gone into free territory, was A, not possible for him to bring the case to the Supreme Court, and B, because he was property, could never be free. That meant at that point, all possible compromises were gone. That takes us to our takeaways. And the big thing that I really tried to stress here, American expansion and manifest destiny led to an expansion out to the West in a fight over slavery. That meant that American national identity was not clear. In fact, instead, there were regional identities. Northern freedom, Southern slavery, Western, kind of up in the air, and Black communities fighting for their freedom as well. We also saw this division leading into a party system that eventually became regional itself. So first, the Democrats were known as the Democratic Republicans. They became the Jacksonian Democrats. You had the Whig Party. When the Whig Party collapsed in the 1850s, you had the Republicans. The Democrats would be almost entirely located in the South. The Republicans were definitely entirely located up in the North. Okay, see you guys in class.